without proof or any DNA evidence, it's been listed as critically endangered by the IUCN and possibly extinct. However, get this, 2022, there was a glimmer of hope of possible sighting in the exact same region. Researchers even collected potential fecal samples that they think belong to said squirrel to test for DNA. And if the poo sample turns out to be real and gives us a positive ID for the squirrel, then it could be one of the biggest rediscoveries of our time. But until then, the Namdapha flying squirrel remains a literal ghost of the treetops. Next up, a bird that feels like it literally slipped straight into legend. Meet the Seow scops owl. This species is a tiny, elusive owl known only from a single specimen collected back in 1866. That's over a century and a half ago. And since then, there's been literally nothing. Not even any photos, sightings, no calls that can be verified. The only semi-conclusive thing that there's been is stories by locals from one small volcanic island in Indonesia and one old preserved bird sitting in a museum drawer. The initial story behind this owl discovery starts on Seow Island, which is north of Sulawesi, a remote place that was covered in forest back in the day. Sadly, today, most of it is gone, which doesn't look too promising for our little owl. The Seow scops owl was first described from that one holotype that was collected during the 19th century, and nobody's ever managed to find another. It's believed to have lived in the island's lowland rainforest, flying between branches in the dense, humid canopy. Given its relatives like the Sulawesi and the Shanghai scops owl, it was probably a nocturnal forest hunter that fed on insects and small invertebrates and blending perfectly into the bark of trees. However, here's where things get interesting. Some scientists aren't even totally sure what our owl is to begin with. The taxonomy of this owl has been debated for years. Some researchers think it's its own distinct species, while others believe it could just be a subspecies of another Indonesian scops owl. But the problem when you're debating something like that, there's literally only one of that specimen to go off of. You can't exactly run genetic tests or compare behaviors when the only thing you've got is a 150-year-old bird in a museum. All that DNA is extremely fragmented and degraded, and there's not really any help a sample that old can provide. Despite that, there have been rumors. In 2017, a video popped up online of a small owl that was caught inside a building in Seow. Locals swore it matched the description of the Seow scops owl, and the footage sparked a huge wave of excitement among ornithologists and birders. Could this have been it? The first living evidence of the Seow scops owl in over a century? Unfortunately, we don't really know. Even after all the analysis, with tons of scientists looking at said video footage, no one could really confirm it, and it still remains unverified. And since then, teams have gone back to Seow, hiking through the last scraps of forest, setting up nocturnal listening stations, recording calls through the night, putting up cameras, but unfortunately, they didn't get anything. The biggest reason that we haven't seen it again is that the forests of Seow are almost gone. Back in the late 1990s, researchers estimated that only about 50 hectares of forest remained on the island, most of it clinging to the steep slopes of Mount Tamata, which also happens to be an active volcano. The rest of the island had been cleared for farming, logging, and plantations. For a species that probably depends on dense forest cover, that's quite literally a death sentence. Still, conservationists aren't giving up. Various organizations have been funding surveys on Seow and nearby islands, hoping to find just one to prove it's still out there. Because if it is, the population would almost certainly be tiny, maybe as few as a dozen birds at most. But even that would be enough to give the ghost species a second chance. Until that day, though, the Seow scops owl remains one of the great mysteries of the bird world, a tiny forest owl that vanished, seen once in 1866 and never again. Now, this next species is the OG ghost lizard, and there are a few ghost lizards out there, lizards that have been seen once and then never again, or not seen for many years, but the species I'm talking about is the Navassa curly-tailed lizard. This species was discovered back in 1868, and like the other four animals we've previously talked about, we only know it existed because of the one single specimen, and that's it. The whole description of this species is based on that single preserved female that someone collected on Navassa Island, a tiny uninhabited dot in the Caribbean. It had this dark gray body with faint bands running across its back and a tail that faded from pale at the base to deep gray near the end. That seems pretty unassuming and quite ordinary for a lizard. But what made it special was the same thing that gives the whole group its name, that little cute curly tail. You might have seen them in Florida, but curly-tailed lizards have a weird behavior where they perform this curled tail lift. And they do this regardless of whether or not a predator's around, almost like they're showing off. Here's the crazy thing though, that one specimen was all scientists had for over 50 years, until another one supposedly turned up in 1917, collected by a guy named Rollo Beck. However, decades later, when another herpetologist took a closer look, he went, yeah, that's not it. Turns out that the lizard Rollo collected only just turned out to be a completely different species altogether. So in the end, we're back to square one, that single lizard collected 157 years ago. Guys, this is just a small handful of examples of unbelievable creatures that may still be out there that are known from a single specimen ever. There are many more out there, and I'd love to do more breakdowns. So if you like these kind of lists, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll do some more. See you on the next one.